so folks can settle in. Go ahead, Jordan, take a seat. All right, welcome everybody. It is Wednesday, and for the diehards, that means you're nearly halfway through the 2024 UNC Water and Health Conference. Let's get folks to settle down a bit. Great. Remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint, so pace yourselves. You've got a couple more days to go, and there are exciting days ahead. Today's October 16th, and unlike Indigenous Peoples Day or Global Hand Washing Day, today really isn't a special day of note, except that we get to spend it together and in good company and get to work to make the world a little bit healthier, more prosperous, and equitable. So there's nothing wrong with that. So as we do every day, we want to thank our sponsors. Thank you very much. Again, you guys know this by now, right? We cannot do this without you. You should be able to say this and repeat it after me. Thank you very much to all our sponsors once again, especially the Osprey Foundation, Conrad and Hilton Foundation, RTI International, Chemonics, World Vision, Business Connect, and Children's Safe Drinking Water, P&G. We really, really appreciate their support, and of course from all of our donors. Speaking of money, let me remind those who haven't yet paid to please do pay. We really do need those registration fees to survive. We appreciate that. For those of you who have already paid or are looking for other ways to help support the Water and Health Conference, you always can go up and get some of the merchandise that we've got. You're welcome to water bottles or tote bags. I feel like I'm at NPR right now, tote bags or anything else. So go ahead and stop at the table up front. Okay. We will get to the plenary in just a second, so maybe, let me talk a little bit about the upcoming plenaries for the rest of this week. Again, most of you guys, I think, know this. There may be some new people who start to trickle in today and tomorrow as we head into Friday, which again will be our focus on high-income countries. Today, we'll talk about finance. I'll get to that in a second. Thursday, we'll talk about this nexus between WASH and climate resilience, and we'll be exploring the issues surrounding that. And then on Friday, as I mentioned, we'll be looking at high-income countries, two guest speakers, Michael Regan, the administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and Elizabeth Beiser, who is the former secretary of the Department of Environmental Quality here in North Carolina. And again, you can imagine there's a lot of issues that have been going on in the state, and we're very excited to have all of them here on Friday. So do stick around, and again, I think you'll start to see another pulse of people coming in. Okay, so I think most of you know, some of you know, I mean, I started my career as a car mechanic, and so I spent most of my days covered with grease and smelling of gasoline. I actually still love that smell. I mean, I know at that point it had lead, but it's still something that I miss. I mean, never mind. But I do remember being in awe of some of my colleagues who could build or fix anything. I mean, they were some of the most brilliant people that I had ever met, despite the fact that they had never had the chance or never finished high school and never had the chance to go on to college. But I was amazed at their ability to do things. And I was reminded a little bit about that last night as I watched the movie. How many of you saw the movie last night? I was supposed to be working, but I stopped in and I couldn't walk out again. And so for those of you who missed it, you should definitely check this out because it really does suck you in. And so I really want to give a special thanks to William for being with us and sharing his story. I thought that was wonderful, and so just thank you very much for that last night. I also want to thank Laura Gomez-Rodriguez and Claire Howard, who helped clean up all the popcorn after last night's movie event, so thank you very much. We're very grateful for that. This idea of overlooking people that matter and whose dedication to their profession is critical to our success and well-being is something that we really need to work to recognize, and that's something that we here at our conference try to do. We know that sanitation workers in particular provide an essential public service, but that the service comes at the expense often of their own health, their own dignity, and that they often endure poor living conditions and lack of strong employment support. To encourage research on these issues, UNC, the Water Institute, and the Initiative for Sanitation Workers support the Sanitation Workers Research Awards. To introduce some of our concerns and describe the plight of sanitation workers, I'd like to invite Mary James Gill from the Center of Law and Justice in Pakistan to the podium. Mary.
Good morning, everyone. In 2022, I stood here to highlight the struggles of sanitation workers in Pakistan. Today, I want to remind you that this struggle is still present and not unique to one country. It's a harsh reality faced by many sanitation workers worldwide. Imagine a city without sanitation workers, streets overflowing with waste and sewage water, diseases spreading, and communities unable to function. Yet, the very workers who keep our cities clean and protect public health are often ignored, unprotected, and unheard. This is especially true in low-income countries where these workers face some of the most dangerous working conditions. In South Asia, Africa, and Latin America, they often work without basic safety gear, are exposed to hazardous waste, human excreta, and lack formal training or protection. They remain invisible in policy discussions and data. We don't even know how many sanitation workers there are worldwide. We don't know how many of them have died, got infected, or got injured. Without this data, they're excluded from critical health and labor protections, perpetuating poverty and exclusion. This invisibility has real consequences. In many countries, marginalized communities, whether by caste, class, religion, or ethnicity, are often forced into this dangerous sanitation work with no freedom to refuse or seek better opportunities. In several cases, this is a forced labor, a form of modern-day slavery. In Pakistan, for instance, many of these workers come from marginalized Christian minority communities, facing not only workplace hazards, but also deep-rooted social stigma. When they die, their families are often left without legal protection or financial support, trapped in poverty for generations. I could tell you about Asad Masih, a 15-year-old boy who was forced into a manhole by his contractor, where he died from toxic gases, a tragic example of forced child labor. Babar Masih, a 31-year-old sewer cleaner, was swept away while working without protective gear. For 11 agonizing days, his employer did not even bother to search for his body, which was recovered on the 12th day after public pressure we created on social media. But the injustice that claimed his life is still unchallenged. And then there is Nadeem Masih, who worked for 17 years without a contract. He died from toxic gases after being forced to clean a sewer on his work day off. His widow is also fighting for justice. These stories are not isolated. The question remains, how many more lives must be lost to keep our sanitation systems running? However, there has been some progress too. In recent years, the Center for Law and Justice, I lead, has championed sanitation workers' rights through Sweepers as Superheroes digital advocacy movement, data-driven lobbying, and empowerment initiatives across 20 cities in Pakistan. This led to the formation of Pakistan's first Sweepers Association, equipping workers with leadership skills and advocacy tools to engage in policy discussions. Our Dignity Award ceremony and Dignity Convention have provided workers with a platform to engage directly with government officials and stakeholders. A digital curriculum is also in the making to amplify these efforts. A recent Punjab Assembly debate sparked by a research acknowledged sanitation workers' struggle, resulting in raised pay scales and clearer paths for promotion, breaking the cycle of being stuck in the lowest pay scale. But one of the most significant outcomes have been the formation of Pakistan's first sanitation workers' union in Lahore, which began as the Sewermen Association in 2020. Many of these successes were enabled by the small grant support from the Initiative for Sanitation Workers, formed by ILO, WHO, World Bank, SNV, and WaterAid. Another 5 organizations like mine, including 2 sanitation workers groups, have received these grants and could tell you about the progress they have made in their countries. Sadly, instead of scaling up the support to sanitation workers, the progress is now at risk of stalling as the ISW project funding comes to an end. Without continued support from ISW or other international partners, we and the 5 other organizations will lose the momentum we have achieved at the community and policy levels. As you discuss water and sanitation today, remember, sustainable sanitation hinges on sanitation workers who are too often forgotten. I urge all donors, foundations, and partners to stand with these workers, advocate for their rights, and invest in them. Achieving 2030 goal for clean water, sanitation, and decent work for all requires ensuring dignity, safety, and employment security of these workers. Let's imagine a future where these workers are protected, empowered, and treated with dignity, able to develop high-quality sanitation services. This future is within our reach, but only if we act now by prioritizing them and humanizing them in the broader sanitation discussions as key stakeholders. Thank you.
So now you know why we make time for this. It's a critically important issue, and people who give their lives for all of us. To present the Sanitation Workers Research Awards, I'd like to invite Andres Hueso Gonzalez, Senior Policy Analyst at WaterAid.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks, Mary, for the introduction. I won't repeat the importance of sanitation workers because it has been already highlighted, but I think it's important to remark that there is this clear moral imperative for action on this topic, but there is also a practical imperative, because if we want to realize the SDG ambition of safely managed sanitation for all, we need a workforce that thrives. We cannot have workers that die. And I think there was a lot of discussion on professionalizations on Monday in the plenary, and I think thoughtful formalization of informal service providers needs to be a really important part of that, and a core element of our sanitation system strengthening agenda. This is easier said than done, and I think that's why it's really important to have more research that looks at these topics and that is centered around the voices and the priorities of sanitation workers. And that's why it makes me very proud to be able to announce this 4th edition of the Sanitation Workers Research Awards in collaboration between the Initiative for Sanitation Workers and the UNC Water and Health Institute. Without further ado, I'm very happy to announce the Best Research Abstract Awards. We have there was a very tough competitions, and we had a triple tie in the 2nd place for the Best Research Abstract. So I will invite my colleague Prerna Somani to hand out the awards, and I will name the awardees and ask them to come out. So the 2nd place for Best Research Abstracts goes for analysis of working arrangements and financial capacity conditions of sanitation workers in Kampala City, Uganda, led by Hakumu Severi, and collecting the award is Shaka Bakabulundi. Thank you very much. Next is the abstract title, Impact of Fecal/Emptying Technology on the Occupational Health of Humanitarian Sanitation Workers in Bangladesh. Lead author is Rahima Nanusi, and they are joining us virtually, so we will send the award also via email. Finally, strengthening social accountability for improved sanitation and occupational health of manual pit emptiers in Kenya, led by Leonita Sumba, and collecting the award is Innocent Kamara. And the winner of the best research abstract is the unforeseen adverse outcomes associated with formalization of fecal/emptying services in municipalities of Bangladesh. The lead author is Tasrina Habib Anania, and I think we have a lot of the co-authors that are going to jointly collect the award: Tasin Hossain, Tanvir Ahmed, and Danny Barrington. Congratulations. And we have also the best published paper category, which goes to the paper titled Evaluation of Occupational Health and Safety, Intervention of the Waste and Sanitation Workers in Bangladesh during COVID-19. And the lead author and multiple awardee is Tanvir Ahmed. Please. Thank you very much to everyone, and I encourage you to submit your abstracts and papers to the 5th Research Award next year, hopefully. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andreas, and congratulations to all of you for the great research. Okay, on to today's plenary event. We've all heard it, right, that the root of the WASH crisis is the lack of funding. What we've learned recently is that this is a bit more nuanced. Yes, there are gaps. Yes, there are funding that is difficult to secure, but we're learning more and more about what we can do to make WASH services more attractive to financing. And this is what we'll be talking about today. So we're very excited to have, where's Joel? Joel's right here. To kick off today's plenary, I'd like to invite up Joel Kolker, who is now a Water Emeritus Ambassador. We have to think of some good title for Joel, who will kick us off on the plenary.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Thanks very much. I know, and thanks for joining. I know this is a difficult subject. A friend told me once that I just want the money to be there so that I can get on with my work. And I understand that. And what we're going to try to do in this session is explain a little bit about some of the pieces of the financing scheme and where we should concentrate as a sector. And first, I'm going to talk about the problem, and then I'm going to let my former colleague Jason talk about the overall solution, and then we're going to get into discussion with your input, so please get your questions ready, and particularly focusing on some of the regulatory issues, and also this mysterious thing called climate finance. But first, I want you to help me identify what the problem is. So can we turn on the lights for a minute? See, you're gonna work. You thought you were getting off easy here, all right? And all you have to do is use your hands. And if you've seen me do this before, please just play along with me. I have 3 questions for you, all right? And I want everyone to participate, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of money here and you may win, okay? So, if you work with a utility or a water service provider or a sanitation agency or a regulator in water, anything to do with water or sanitation, put your hand up. Really? Come on, up, proud. You should be proud. What are you doing here if you're not doing this? Everybody should have their hand up, all right? Second question, no, keep it up. Yeah, come on, I told you you're gonna work for their money, okay? If you have a bank account, participate in a national social security program, have a healthcare savings account, are saving for your kids' education, or even a car, keep your hand up. And I'm not gonna steal your money, so I'm not gonna be your financial advisor. Keep your hand up. All right, last question. This is the hard one. Keep it up. All right, if you would feel comfortable with the money that you're saving, your hard-earned money, and taking that money and investing it in the water utility you're working with, keep your hand up. Okay. That's our problem. See, you did the work for me. All right, very easy, right? This is the problem, okay? We can talk about digitalization, we can talk about all the new technology we want, We can talk about all of this. But if we don't get the foundational issues correct, nothing else will move forward. And that's what we're going to talk about. And I want to introduce Jason and ask you to come on up. Jason is a global lead for water and finance at the World Bank. He's been at the institution for about 20 years. Prior to that, he worked in private banking and is a real expert on infrastructure financing. So I'm going to turn it over to Jason, and then I'm going to ask him to join me with Robert and Rachel, and we're going to have a dialogue with you. Thank you, and thanks for participating.
Thank you very much, Joe, and good morning, everyone. It's really a real pleasure to be here with you. So in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to give you a quick high-level overview in terms of what are the water crises we're facing right now and the huge financing need we need, and a reality check in terms of where we stand in terms of how much resources we have and we have put into the water sector to meet the demand that we need to reach SDG 6, and how to close the financing gap, and the role of a private sector in this process, and how to scale up. Okay? Water crisis and impacts. We all understand the climate crisis, but few of us understand that the climate crisis actually is about the water crisis. So the three pictures we show here really tells you the too much water, too polluted, and too little. So the planet is going through this crisis that where we don't need that much water, we're getting too much of that. Where we need the water, we don't have that much, and the water is being polluted. And the climate changes, the population growth and urbanizations, and the consumption pattern and the pollutions has been driving the process, giving us a lot more pressure, and give us the sense of urgency to address the crisis. By 2030s, the demand for water is expected to exceed supply by 40%. So the financing need to be huge to address those issues. You see here also, look at the gap. It's really staggering and affecting all the regions. You see here, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, and East Asia, where we have the huge or the largest gap. And 2.2 billion people without clean water, 3.5 billion people without clean sanitations. Those are the number, I think most of you are very familiar with that, so I'm not going to get into details on that. In this map, you will see that where the issues by the regions. So with the huge financing need that we need to address to reach SDG 6, where we are. So the recently published public expenditure reviews done by the World Bank, some of you have heard from Claire yesterday, really also give us a wake-up call in terms of where we are. So on the left-hand side, we see the water financing need. We need $6.7 trillion by 2030s, and $22.6 trillion by 2050s. And yet, in reality, we only invest $164 billion every year to address the issues. So if you do the math closely, we are only investing about 1% what is needed to get to SDG 6. Yeah? And you look at the breakdown of these numbers, the government are only investing 0.5% of GDP on average in water sectors. And the private sector spendings only make up about 2% of this, what we needed, right? Majority of this $164 billion are coming from the public sector, 86% to be exact, right? At the bottom, you'll see also what I highlighted in red is only 1.2% of government budget is for water. This compared to 4 to 5% for energy and the transport sectors, and 60% for human development. And yet we know that without water, or the water impact on human development is huge. If you only invest 1.2% of government budget in water, and yet 60% in human development, it's not going to be very effective. And a large spending gap in water sanitation supply, you see that also again, the breakdown by regions. to meet SDG 6 target by 2030, you see that the biggest gap is in sub-Saharan Africa, $74 billion will be needed, and South Asia, $36 billion, right? And LAC is about 13 billion. So no matter how we see the numbers, the bottom line is that the demand is huge, but we're not investing enough in this, both from public sector and the private sector, right? So this is where we have the huge market failures and also government failure in this space. So this chart give you a diagram, show you the required spending versus actual spendings, how that compares. So I'm going to start with this. So by region, you see that sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia is 17 times versus 8.8 times compared to what is needed, right? And also looking at the FCV, fragile conflict environment, and also the least developing countries on the left-hand side, 42 times and versus 28 times, yeah? So again, the message is the same thing, that the demand is huge, and we're not having enough resources to meet that. So is spending in water a matter of a choice? If you look at this, look at per capita public spending in WASH versus military, right? WASH is $11 on average versus $70 compared to military. You see that it's a policy choice here, right? Government has a decision to make here. Additional observation here is also that investing more is not enough, and we also need to invest smarter and better. So with the limited spending we have in water sectors, the budget execution is quite low. The average budget execution in water sector is about 72%. Which means that over 25% of the fund were not used, yeah? So the basis was low, but then even with that low budget, that has not been spent effectively. And almost 20% of water sector finance are being lost due to dishonest and corrupt practice. So we need to invest more and also smarter. So how to close the financing gap? In the next couple of slides, we're going to explain how the water sector financing works. On the left-hand side, you see the cost. So this diagram tries to explain the sources and the uses for water sector. On the left-hand side, you see the capital maintenance, financial cost, investment cost, and operation maintenance, right? We need money to address all those issues for the water sector financing. How are we going to fund those things? There are 3 T's you heard yesterday from Joe, right? The transfer, the taxes, and the tariff. The transfer refers to the, mostly from the donors. But you see that it's highlighted in yellow because this is part of money is not reliable and it's shrinking. So the real reliable resources only come from the taxes and the tariffs, right? So if the government make policy choices that to keep the tariff low for political and social considerations, then we have to find another source to address that, make sure you have commitment from the taxes side, right, to address the issues. In reality is that revenue is only counting for about 78% of the operating costs. So we have huge issues in the water sector, how to address the financing gap. So that on the top of that, you see the funding gap that will need to be addressed. This can be financed through the repayable financing, either from the concessional financing sources from the bilaterals, from the multilateral development banks or international finance institutions, or from private finance. And what does the financing mean, repayable finance? In plain language, it's a borrowing. But if it's a borrow, that means the money is not free, it needs to be repaid, need to be paid back. Ultimately, as you see from here, the source of a payment of the debt of the borrowing still come from either the taxes or the tariffs. There's no free money in the system, right? And we're talking about the transfer or the donor funding is shrinking and is not that predictable. The role of our private sectors. So what I just showed here in terms of the how to bridging the financing gap, the private financing. So early on, remember we talked about the private sector financing into the overall government, into the water financing is less than 2%. So we really need to work hard to scale up the private finance. How to scale up that? We don't have a specific number for the water financing from the private sector perspective, but overall in the infrastructure, we have seen that private investment in infrastructure has been declining over time, especially during the COVID time from 2020, 2021, and 2022. You see the number has dropped dramatically for well-known reasons, right? And here we also have the breakdown of the private sector investment into infrastructure by sectors. Majority of the money come into the transportation sector and the energy sector. The money for the water sector is on the top. You see that how small that it has been. Yeah? And exactly in what form the private sector money come in, majority of that, 67% is coming from commercial banks or investment banks, basically the loans we talked about. The other three big chunk of that is from the developers. When the private sector sponsor come in, putting the equity into the sectors. The multilateral development banks or other development banks is about 5.7%, and then other private sector money come into this. In terms of the debt, you see that overall, in terms of the financial instrument coming from the private sectors, between the debt, equity, and the grants only 0.5%. This is what we already talked about, the 3T, the transfer, right? The equities from private sector is about 13.5%, and the debt is about 86%. So majority of the private sector come in the form, the financing come from in the debt form. And then below that is that house breakdown by 82% of the debt is coming from the loans, and only 18% of that is from bond. Yeah? So how to scale up? So to scale up the finance, first of all, we have to understand what has been holding the private sector back, right? So Joe asked the question early on, would you feel comfortable to put the money into the water sector? No. Why is that? Because of all these reasons we listed here. First of all, the enabling environment, the regulatory environment that we're facing, right? The fragmentation of the responsibility across multiple government agencies. A lot of times, especially when we go to developing countries, we see so many different government agencies. The role and the responsibility are not very clear. And that created a lot of efficiency issues, that created weak policies, institutional and regulatory framework for those countries, that the private sector will not feel comfortable investing in the sectors. And the most important thing we highlight in blue here is the sector financial sustainabilities. With underpricing of the water, that not only created issues about the efficiency, but also with the water scarcities, with underpricing issues also does not create incentive for the conservations, for water reuses. And then at the bottom of the list, all the other issues that are critical for the water sector is the low capacity and the inefficiency of the utilities, and also limited wastewater treatment and reuse. Water has been viewed as a social good in many places. Because of that, we talked about earlier, the political and the social considerations. A lot of government have the tendency to keep the water tariff artificially low, not cost reflective. With that, then you will not be able to have a credit-worthy utilities. Again, then the lenders will not feel comfortable to invest into the sectors. A lot of times we say that the sector is not bankable, the project is not bankable, because the lender has no confidence that the utilities or the municipal government will have enough resources to pay back the loans they borrow. And the poor coordination and the public trust. To address those issues, we need to accelerate the utility reforms, create an enabling environment for the private sector to come in, reform the water pricing, we talked a lot about that already, and strengthen the capacities. In many of the developing countries, the capacity has been low, as many of you have personal experience working with them, and scaling up the subnational finance, creating the local currency finance facilities, financial intermediaries, creating the strengthen through the local banking market. Ultimately, that's the way to address the financing gaps. We cannot just rely on the dollar financing or the financing from the overseas, from the foreign banks. So how to attract the financing? Again, talking about the pricing issues, the fundamental issues. We need to have the cost-reflective and affordable pricings to make sure that this is the fundamental to make the utilities or municipality become credit-worthy in the end. Throughout the process, of course, the pro-poor and progressive tariff and also importance to find the balance between the cost-reflective and also the affordability for the poor people will be considered. And the subsidies, and a lot of times, the World Bank has done recently did the subsidy reform studies on that. We found a lot of the subsidy has not been used in the right places. Many places has been used to actually not targeting the poor people. So the subsidy reform is also critical, and also for the to address the water scarcity issues we have mentioned earlier. I think you can skip this slides. So the possible financing solutions to address the water sector. There's two ways that the water sector can raise financing. One is municipality or the utilities raising financing, sometimes also called the corporate finance structures. Basically, you look at the creditworthiness of the water sectors or the utilities. Or you finance it through individual projects. So private sector come in through the PPPs. We sometimes call that a private project finance. For each of those two streams, on the left-hand side and the middle side, you have different financial instruments to address those issues. Subnational finance, or the grants, blended finance, microfinance, climate finance, that can help with the subnational and the utility finance. For the private sector participation, or the PPP or project finance, often comes as equity or the debt financing. And because of all the issues we're talking about, the creditworthiness issues and the underpricing issues in developing countries, we cannot wait until we address all these policy issues. So in between, there's different risk instruments that can help increase the investors' confidence to help them mitigate some of the risk through the insurance product, from the guarantee products. For example, the World Bank offered the partial risk guarantees or political risk insurance to help raise the credit profile of some of the utilities or the project to make this project bankable. Overall, in the end, the high-level message is very clear, is that we need more finance into the water sector, but the issue is not about the money itself, and the solution is also outside the money itself, right? We need to build an enabling environment, address the institutional, policy, and the regulatory framework issues. On the right-hand side, we talked about that. And always also need to do the policy, the pricing reforms to make sure that to create a more enabling environment for the credit-worthy utilities and make the municipalities more bankable, right? More credit-worthy for the private sector. And also we need to create more bankable projects. A lot of times we hear from the investors, from private sectors, money is not the issue. The issue is not enough bankable projects. So address the issues from the institutional enabling environment perspective, from the creditworthiness of the utilities and the municipalities, create more bankable projects. Ultimately, we work on those pillars will help create the path to the commercial finance to help bring more private sector finance into the water sectors. So that's the high-level kind of summary for that. Thank you for your attention.
Jason? Come and sit down. Thank you, Jason. So you've, Robert and Rachel, do you want to come on up? As they're coming up, we started by talking about the problem, and Jason just laid out the solution. And please prepare your questions. I just want to summarize two quick things that Jason said while they're coming to the stage. Number one, the solution really is about the efficiency of our providers and governance and institutional arrangements. And number two, we really only have two revenue sources. You hear about the 3 Ps. The reality is transfers are grants, and they're going down. And we really need to look at tariffs or taxes. And if tariffs aren't going to cover, the taxes have to come in. And with that other T, we may be looking at tariffs, taxes, or trouble. And that's where we're headed if we, seriously, this is where we're headed if we don't start to get this right. So based on this, I want to have a conversation, and I want you to join in the conversation in a couple minutes. But I have a few questions. I want to ask both Rachel and Robert what they thought of Jason's presentation. And let me start with Robert. For those of you who don't know Robert, was the longest serving regulator in the subcontinent of Africa, and arguably the best regulator. Part of that is because we don't have enough regulators, but that's a different story. But Robert is now a consultant, and the beauty of speaking with Robert is he's very clear, very transparent, and very direct. So Robert, let me start by asking you, you heard a lot about the efficiency issue, but quite a bit about how critical governance in the regulatory environment is in this process. What's some of your reaction? And please tell us, what is the role of a regulator in this process? What are the opportunities and what are some of the challenges you faced in your situation in Kenya? It's a loaded question, I appreciate that.
Yes, it is loaded. Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be back to this stage again. Regulators are used to this kind of these kind of situations. But I just want to say that whenever you are looking at our water and sanitation sector, anytime you want to talk about sustainable services, in my view, there are about 3 or 4 critical elements you need to actually have in place before you even talk about sustainability. One is related to our values. Does the community consider water and sanitation as a priority for them? What about the sector efficiency in terms of how governments are actually implementing the services and using the funds? And what about the subsidy policy? How does government use its available money? What does it subsidize? What does it support? And also have an effective regulatory framework. Regulation comes in as part of the wider government reform. The reform comes in because we are fed up with a sector of low investments, low quality of service standards, low governance standards and everything. So regulation is part of that reform agenda to make sure that we have an efficient sector, to make sure that we have a sector that considers equity and inclusion, and to make sure that we have a viable sector. And viability is really about your water service and sanitation service management arrangements. Are those arrangements efficient? Is the governance right? And if it is not, what can be done and who is going to steward that? That is really what regulation is all about. And it just comes to allow even government long-term policy objectives to be met. Our sector depends on infrastructure that once you put it on the ground, it takes 10, 20, 30 years. So you really want to be sure that what you are putting on the ground will be sustainable and you continue delivering the service over time. Now, unfortunately, we have our policymakers who depend on very short time frames. That is 4 or 5 years time frame. So they are not able to make decisions beyond that. And that is really why regulation comes in. And it's not, you realize that I'm talking about regulation, not regulator. So you have to actually internalize that, and it doesn't really matter. Sometimes you don't really have to be so worried about the model, just to make sure that if regulation has to be there, and how is it going to be implemented? And how is it going to make sure that the sector continues to deliver what's supposed to deliver? Now, there are challenges to that because regulation is not an end. Once you have a regulator, and this in the global south, sometimes we tend to assume that once you put in the infrastructure, once you put in the institutional architecture, then you have solved the problem. That is only the easiest and very small part of the problem. You have to actually allow these organizations to work, and that is where our challenge becomes. And that is why most of these challenges we are talking about here in terms of very low efficiencies, water, costs that cannot be recovered, is because we seem to have a morbid fear of the tariff, a morbid fear of talking about the repairable finance. Now, this these sources of money we are talking about, for me, those are the three sources of money we talk about. But for me, the most predictable and the one to focus on is the tariff, because even the source, even the repayable finance, we consider it as another source. It's not another source. It's repayable, so it has to come from that tariff that we are going to put together. So it's really not another source. We just make sure that if that money has to come in, we prepare the policy and regulatory environment that attracts that money. We cannot be talking about repayable finance if the environment does not allow for repayable finance. And this is really what I think what we are talking about in terms of having a sector that is viable, utilities that are creditworthy. We have talked about creditworthiness for quite some time yesterday, and I believe there is still a lot to talk about and all this. So regulators are in that unenviable position of making sure that that sector is, the players are actually given some confidence and conviction that if I'm going to bring in money here, then my money will be repaid back, and I'm sure there will be no kind of opportunistic activities or opportunism from government. I was really worried about the third question that Joel asked. And I'm imagining there could be one or two utility managers who actually cannot give money to their utility. So you would want to ask, then what is it you're managing? What is it you're managing if you cannot have confidence in yourself repaying back your money if you're going to spend it on your utility? Yeah.
So bottom line is you need the institutional arrangements, but more importantly, they have to be implemented with integrity.
Exactly, and you need, the basics cannot be implemented without integrity. Because a lot of us have very good policy frameworks, very good legal frameworks. Then you ask yourself, where is the problem? Then the problem must be to the team that is actually implementing this, because organizations are about people. And remember, those people are the ones either will be the problem and will also be the solution. So they have to make decisions in terms of how they intend to navigate around their own stewardship, their own integrity. And that is really, really important. And as I said, when you started this, trying to solve this so-called governance crisis of bringing in regulation, I think there were supposed to be also other complementary actions. These complementary actions, if I can just paraphrase, were about even our mindset changing, especially with our policymakers, to make sure that now we have a sector that is really having very big problems that are not necessarily insurmountable. And the second aspect is that we also have a team that is stewarding this, who may not be having the capacity and the competencies that are required. And also our management practices. How are you going to tweak or change or kind of have a whole paradigm shift of our management practices so that we are in line with the challenges that we intend to actually address? Those are complementary to what we are talking about, having very technically efficient and operationally efficient utilities, and also very effective governance and policy and legal frameworks that actually are a kind of a foundational issue. But another foundation below that is our own values and aspirations. What do we exactly believe in? We believe in having a sector that can actually deliver for whatever other socio-economic developments that we may want to be supported. What are we really working for in terms of fit-for-purpose kind of organizations?
Thanks, Robert. Very helpful. Rachel, you're currently the Director of Program and Investment at the Resilient Water Accelerator, but you're a seasoned professional in the water sector who's recently moved over to climate in a big way. A lot of the things that Jason and Robert have mentioned directly relate to our ability to get climate finance. So I have a couple questions for you. First of all, I think there's a real misunderstanding of what climate finance is. There's a perception out there that somehow it's different from a grant or a guaranteed loan. Can you just clarify that? And then how does securing climate finance differ or relate to the scenarios that Jason and Robert laid out about the need for efficiency and governance and institutional arrangements?
Great questions, Joel. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel and to see many familiar faces and so many unfamiliar faces that I look forward to getting to know. I wanted to just make, before I get into what is climate finance, I just wanted to make a couple of observations on Jason's presentation, if that's possible. Okay, so the first is, I've been working in the water sector around economics and policy and financing since a really long time, so since the late 90s. And I could tell you that your last slide on what's holding the sector back isn't really all that different from the slides that we've been seeing. And you know, when we move back to that level of let's summarize and synthesize what's needed, at the high level, a lot hasn't changed, even though there's been tremendous innovation and a lot of the work that you all are doing, right, is really great, and frontier pushing and so forth. Really, a lot of these core sector problems are the same. The other observation I had was this, you know, when we look at the PPI, I highly recommend go to the PPI database and go play around in it. If
Just
you've never,
explain what the public-private
public-private
infrastructure
private
database.
participation in infrastructure database. It's a really great database. You can look by sectors. And so I was noticing that some of the sources there, I just highly recommend it. It's a very cool source of information. If you look and you compare energy and water investments and private participation in infrastructure, you can see that actually a lot of the investment is like a single investment. So if you look at water investment in a lot of low and middle income countries, you might think, ooh, there's like $200 million of investment in whatever, in Rwanda. Well, that's one plant. It's not that there's a diversified investment base or that there's a lot of money going in. It's a single deal that often took between maybe 8 and 10 years to develop. So I just want to, it's useful to have that as a point of reference if you're interested in the sector and you can geek out on policy and economics. So then the,
Sorry.
oh
and
yeah,
also
sure.
a lot of that is Brazil or China.
Totally.
So those outliers really kind of doesn't give you the real picture of what's happening in the world. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the other thing that actually is through the notes that I've prepared for these questions, which are absolutely a total surprise, thank you, Joel, is that the boom or bust, or the absorptive capacity. So it's one of the things, if any of you have seen me on panels, I've not been really around the sector for a long time, but I've often said, and I've often been a champion for, spend the resources that you have well, stop looking for new money, right? And I think that your slide about the absorptive capacity, where 73% of budgets are spent, that's a lot of money that's left on the table. Why is that money not being spent? Why should I trust you and invest in your program, your organization, with my money if you can't even spend the money you have well, right? Like, that's something that we need to really wrestle with. So, but let's switch now to what actually is climate finance. So let's talk about finance versus funding and credit worthiness, because they're all kind of wrapped up in the same burrito, if you will. And one of the ways that I like to think about the world is to test at the extremes. So let's imagine finance. How many of you have a checkbook, a debit account? Yeah. How many of you have credit cards? Yeah, okay, so basically then you know finance because you live in the space of finance. We need money to do things, right? So when it comes to financing programs or projects or whatnot, at the end of the day, it's not all that different, right? You have basically a source of funding and a recipient of funding, and the finance mechanism or the funding mechanism, which those are different things, is basically how money moves from the source of funding to the user of the funding or finance, right? Funding I would define as grant-based, so it's non-repayable, whereas finance is something that requires a return on investment, so it requires some sort of financial return. And, but in reality, right, all of that is based on trust. If I am giving my daughter money, I'm expecting something. I'm not expecting her to repay me, but I am expecting her to do what she says she's gonna do. Right? And so a grant, if you're a philanthropy, you're giving a grant on the expectation that the program, that the activities and things that you've identified in your proposal, that you will actually do them, right? It's very, so that's funding, right? And then in terms of the financing, it's that you will do those things and generate money off of those so that you get a return, a financial return. Okay, so let's imagine at the extremes. We have the super technocratic world, right, where you basically have everything is digitized. You know, you go to, in the US, there are credit rating companies that you can go for your credit score if you're looking to buy a house, right? You know, and everything is technocratic. They just tell you your score, and then they tell you whether you are investment grade or not. That is, you know, a super like non-relational relationship with money that people can have. On the other hand, you have this very trust-based market, which I would argue is very much the sort of philanthropy nonprofit space, right? There's big movements in the philanthropy space for trust-based philanthropy, right? Don't make us do all of these log frames and don't make these proposals so hard. Just give us unrestricted money and let us do the good work that we want to do. That's a big push in the philanthropy space. But in reality, we're somewhere in the middle, right? We're somewhere in between. There's a reason why country clubs exist, right? So why financiers will go and they have their nice steak lunches with their whatever, with their counterparts. Relationships are important no matter what. And there's also a reason why philanthropy, a lot of foundations, you'll notice when you're looking for funding that they do not accept unsolicited proposals, right? Relationships and trust matter. So, as you all know, and as I'm sure you're experiencing, the channels and the networks for sourcing money and spending money have changed dramatically in the last 10 to 15 years. So in terms of, right, so, oh, and I don't think I ever actually said climate finance. Let me talk about climate finance. Everything that I just said, that's climate finance. It's the same damn thing as finance, right? Except climate finance is even more rigorous because the trust includes the trust but verify. So you have to verify the impact in terms of a climate impact, whether that's mitigating or adaptation.
So
yeah,
Rachel, let me just try to summarize one thing you've just said. There's no difference between climate finance and other forms of finance. It's a grant, it could be a loan, it could be equity, it could be a guarantee.
Exactly.
The difference is that when you take a loan, they're assessing you as the individual. They're looking at you as the input. What's different about climate finance, from what I understand, is they're very concerned about what you are going to use the money for. Is that right?
Well, and I would take it even one step further. It's not even what you're using the money for. It's what climate benefit you are deriving from those activities. And that has to be measured, and it has to be reported, and it has to be verified.
Can you give us 2 examples with water and sanitation of what a climate finance eligible project might be? Okay,
so I'm going to give you one example that I get really excited about, which is not about community finance. It's not a sort of development project. But AB InBev, which is a large beverage company, they do alcoholic beverages, they actually signed in a couple of years ago now a 5-year, $10.1 billion of a revolving credit facility that was connected to it's a sustainability linked credit facility, which basically means when they need a line of credit, maybe you use your credit card in this way, right? Or maybe you have an overdraft in your checking account. That's a line of credit for them to be able to invest in things that strengthen their operations. But the interest rate is pegged to the deliverance of water sustainability targets as defined by the Alliance for Water Stewardship and as reported and verified by the CDP. So the Climate Disclosure Project, I should say. So there you have a massive amount of money that then is, because you have the infrastructure for reporting, monitoring, reporting, and verification, that's a lot of money, right, to upgrade all of their operations for water efficiency and water stewardship as defined by the Alliance for Water Stewardship. So that would be a really good example of a climate finance, or because the other parts of the facility included also some greenhouse gas emissions and circularity in terms of plastics and so forth.
But Rachel, to set up all that infrastructure to measure all this, collect all the data, put this all together, it's expensive. How is that handled?
So it's a lot of work that's been done to streamline indicators, to build methods, right, to have standards. So I know, having worked in philanthropy and having worked with private companies on things like the Alliance for Water Stewardship, there's elements of where everybody wants to have their own indicators. Academics love this, right? We're going to create an indicator framework, and then we're going to do research. And there's so many indicators and frameworks that they're not replicable or scalable. And so the magic that allowed for these like this very mainstream integration of sustainability into the capital markets, and I'm using jargon, but basically is because there was a commitment to streamline and standardize indicators. Are they perfect? No. Is there totally a role for academic research to poke holes in those methods? 100%. And to make them better, we can't stand still and rest on our laurels of an indicator framework, but it's really exciting because it opens up that channel between a very trust-based, closed kind of water philanthropy donor space into opportunities that also are raising the ability of private investors to actually be aware of water. So I did research in 2023. I did research in 2023 where I interviewed a whole bunch of investors, from private equity, SME, small and medium enterprise investors, up to institutional investors, insurance companies and whatnot, to try and understand what are your requirements for making investments, and how could water projects fit into those requirements. All of the investors I interviewed, they're private and commercial investors, all of them expressed interest in water. Obviously, they spent time on the phone with me. But however, like what they said is, it's just, we don't have enough experience designing these deals. We read the reports, we read the World Bank reports, we understand that there's a ton of risk. We don't really understand that risk, and we don't know how to enter this space to be able to see if that risk is a threat or if that risk is an opportunity for us to make money.
Okay.
And so I think there's this element of that, of like, I get excited by this, AB and Bev deal because I'm
Right.
like, ooh, that's a toehold.
Okay.
But it's a start.
All
I'll
right.
pause there.
I want to come to Jason in a minute, but I do want to ask people if they have questions, please start lining up. We've got time. You can ask us anything, and we're very open to be challenged and told when we are wrong, so please start lining up. But Jason, I have a quick question for you. You've laid out, I'm coming to him, but I don't want to let you off so easy. You laid out a very comprehensive plan on what needs to be done to change. And we've been at this a long time, but we haven't really moved far enough along on the implementation. Who can drive this process? Who's ultimately responsible? And what are some of the other roles that other people can play to support that dialogue?
Great question. I wish I had a great answer to that. One thing I can compare is, we chatted earlier about my experience or professional experience. A lot of that is in the energy sector. I think what we look at from the energy sector, I started my career in the World Bank by looking, energy sector for sub-Saharan Africa. And at that time, the energy access rate in Africa many countries is less than 10%. These days, you go to Africa, it's a lot of countries we're now talking about on the generation side. There's excess capacity actually already. What we can learn, what we found is of course, one is the technology changes have to drive down the cost of a lot of the energy generations. But most importantly, where we see the big difference is the political commitment from the government, especially from the finance and the private sector perspectives. Without that, and the private sector will not feel comfortable. And with the political commitment, and then with the right sector plannings and the regulatory framework that, Kenya has a great examples. You have the regulatories, you have the cost reflective tariffs, and the transparencies, the consumer, the electricity bill will lay it out, the cost breakdown, even, the interest cost, the FX, foreign exchange rate impact. So that gives the confidence to the consumer, their willingness to pay more, because when they see the quality of service improved, that's definitely worthwhile to pay more for that. So this is a big process, right? So to answer your question, the driver for that to me is like the government, the regulators to begin with, and then the broader stakeholder engagement to have the buy-in from the society, to change the culture and the mentality of this, water should be free, water is the, social public good, all that. So.
And when you say government, do you mean national, regional, or
all of that, the government at the different levels. Yeah.
Okay, and you specifically mentioned the regulators having a role as well. Okay, I'll come back to you, Robert, on that one for your reaction. Sorry, you all forget that I know where your pensions are, so if we don't get more questions, you're going to be deducted pretty soon. Sorry. Go ahead, please. We'll take a couple questions and then we'll come back to the panel.
So
Please.
because I'm asking question, my pension is protected, yeah?
Sorry?
If I'm asking the question, my pension is protected.
We're adding money to it.
Okay, that's good. No, I have two comments. I think the presentation was really, really interesting. My name is Carlos. I'm a student here at UNC, doing my PhD here. But I have 2 points that I want to make and hear your thoughts about that. First, when you say that 25% of the money allocated in the budget is not spent over the year. But what's the cause of that? Because it doesn't only mean that the government doesn't have the capacity. Maybe you didn't collect the taxes to fill the budget and spend the money, you know? So that may not necessarily mean that's the problem with the capacity of the government, but it's the problem with the collection. You estimate an amount of money that will come from taxes, and that money is not collected.
So you want to know the cause of the underspend?
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
And the second point is, when you say here that the solution is bringing private money, I think it's part of the solution, because if today covers 2%, if you multiply by 10, you cover 20% or 25%, so it's lots of them. So how much money you would need to change this equation? I mean, because it seems to me that if you put too much money, even though it's still less than the amount of money that the public has to put in the sector to make it work. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Sorry, too much, you lost me on the second one.
Okay. What I'm saying is that the percentage that today private money goes to the water and sanitation sector
Right.
is very low compared to the
To energy and
so you have to
transport.
multiply them by 10,
Right.
20, 50. So when we will have enough money from private sector to make a difference in the sector too, not only rely on the government.
Okay, all right, over here.
My name is Henk Holtslag from the Smart Center. I have 2 questions for Mr. Jason. First, in your finance overview, I did not see, but maybe I missed it, the investment of families themselves. For instance, in Indonesia, 60 or 70% of the families invest in their own well. So was that included in your overview? That's one question. The second question is about the finance gap. One way to reduce the finance gap is also reducing cost. Yesterday there was a presentation that claimed that by using a supported self-supply approach, you can reduce the cost of rural water supply by 50%. So have you considered reducing cost of water approaches, water systems? Thank you.
Okay, and over here?
Hi everyone, my name is Lisa. I'm the co-founder of Nazafa Water Filters. I manufacture water filters in Indonesia and Kenya. And I really want to compliment the panel by learning from the energy sector. And what I've seen in the energy sector is that decentralized solutions have been embraced. More than 2 million solar lamps have been introduced. And in the energy sector, decentralized solutions have been acknowledged and their power has been acknowledged. Tax reductions, import reductions. There's a whole sector, the GOCLA, the Global Association for the Off-Grid Solar Industry, is there. Now, here we talk about nobody wants to invest in a piped solution. Why are we still looking into these piped solutions? And why are we not acknowledging the power of decentralized solutions? Where actually glass, we shall show 60% of WASH funding comes from households. Why don't we tap into the power of households to already find a solution that fits them, that can reduce stunting and diarrhea?
Okay, I gotcha. We can have a whole conference on that one.
Yes, next year, let's do it.
There's a couple questions online. Can you give us 1 or 2, and then I'm going to come back to the panel.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. I'm not going to go through the whole list there, but it is a growing list. So here's a question from Raj. A question regarding the financing for rural water service systems serving small populations in fragile or low-income contexts. Water wash systems are not directly productive, right? Most of them don't generate income. And so accessing microcredit has been very challenging when other financing options are unavailable. Studies and practices have found that when WASH projects are linked to other productive uses, let's say agriculture, depending on the water source, it could make it easier then for users to obtain credits and develop their water systems. So does that coupling with other sectors enable you to more easily access financing for the WASH work that you want to do? And is this something that the bank and other funders are looking at?
Funding rural sanitation.
That's, well, not rural sanitation, rural water wash
Rural
services.
wash.
Wash services generally.
Okay, what are the issues around funding rural wash?
Well, and whether or not that coupling to other sectors, other more productive sectors, let's say agriculture, which usually can manage.
Okay,
financing,
all
whether
right,
those
got
types of
it. And
couplings
is there
work.
one more, or?
There is. The other relates to, I think it's more of an explanation of Jason, who talked about the value of tariffs, and these really aren't tariffs to begin with. There's transfers, and that transfer process really isn't something that can be relied on. I think you may have to explain that again as to why transfers are no longer a viable mechanism for supporting some of these financing.
Okay, Jason, do you want to start on the question there and deal with also with the underspend question?
So yeah, you may have to help me out on some of these
Okay.
things. Yeah, so a lot of the data I quoted is from the World Bank report on funding for water secure futures, the global public expenditure reviews. Yeah, I cannot remember all the details. So for some of the, if you want to dig out a little bit more on the data, I recommend you to look into that. It's 300-page document. Yeah. So the answer probably is buried somewhere there, okay?
Well, the answer on that is money that was in the account. So that wasn't missing. Nobody was waiting for the revenue to come into government. On the first day of the fiscal year, the money was put in the budget of, say, the water department. At the end of the fiscal year, 365 days later, only 70% of that money was spent.
Yeah, so a lot of that is about the capacity issue, the capacity or capability to implement, right, according to the original budget plan. Yeah.
Okay. And sorry, there was questions here that I hoped you got. All right, we'll come back to that. On this, and then there was a questions on the transfers.
Yeah, the transfer, I mean, a lot of times we talk about the transfer from the donors, right? From the foreign government or internal government transfer. That's quite limited. I mean, the donors or philanthropy money, I mean, we're talking about that, is shrinking. And especially these days with geopolitical concern we have seen, right? And the US election is one thing. And what we have heard from the European donors, for example, they are preparing for different worst-case scenarios. So the overseas development aid budget, the allocation, is shrinking, right? So because of that, we can, that is not a very reliable sources, as we can see. Overall fiscal conditions and the rightist movement in many of the the government we see in different parts of the world are making this even more and more difficult and challenging.
Okay, so we're blessed with Rachel being on the stage because in 2016 she did a study on ODA, which really looked at transfers. And just to summarize again, and Rachel, I'll come to you.
Yeah.
We only have 3 sources of income. It's the 3 T's, or different T's, as I'm proposing. Tariffs are the most reliable source of revenue. Robert mentioned this. It's depending on you providing a service and paying for that service. Every water utility manager that I've spoken to, any in the world, wishes for the day that 100% of their revenue came from tariffs. They control it. They're not dependent on taxes, which is money from the government, which is not always predictable or transparent, or transfers, which are the smallest according to Jason's slides, and also the least predictable. So you want to talk about ODA for a minute?
I just want to add, kind of, but not in the context. I'm trying to think about how to also just make it, because ODA is kind of a wonky subject, and here we are.
But it's a big part of the transfer.
It's a huge part of the transfers, but here's just one of the things I want to share. So think about the market structure or the boundaries for how stuff gets funded. And again, going back to that idea that there's a source of funding and a recipient of funding, right? And that there's trust has to be in between those two things. And in general, when it comes to transfers, the funding flow comes from a global, like from a US, European, international, right, source of funding, and then it's transferred down through into the utility, right, but it makes a couple of stops at the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Water, and then it gets distributed. And the thing is, so that's how the money flows. And then there's this expectation that it will get repaid, but that expectation often isn't met. And in part it's because the information, so I like to look not just at the money, but also the information flows and the accountability flows. And so the information flows, if you model those, generally the information comes back up through donor reporting, right? So you have the money flows down from global to local, information flows from local upwards to global, sometimes in accordance with global standards, but often not. And the accountability is kind of also very messy. It's not really clear who is accountable. So if you are a utility and you're underspending, well, there's not really the accountability for, well, what do you do? Do you lose that 20% that you've left on the table? Do you just find somewhere to spend it, even if that's not the most effective way of doing it? And part of that has been because historically, in this aid transfer space, we have avoided engaging regulators. And I think in this new climate finance reality, honestly, we're like all finance is going to be climate finance. It's going to be tied because of the technological just revolution that is underway in terms of our ability to monitor and demand for monitoring and disclosure about impact. And water is getting wrapped up and rolled up into climate conversations, whether we are sitting at the table or not, right? But the rise of the regulators, sorry, I have to get this because we are in an era where the rise of the regulators, I want you to remember that, because the regulatory bodies in country are just becoming more and more important to allow for the commenter who was talking about why aren't we looking at decentralized solutions, because we don't invest enough in our regulators. So you can have, the energy is a product, those solar lamps and whatnot are products. We're talking about services where there needs to be an alternative. You need to actually have a good service. You need a regulator to do that. And so I want to also just, defer to Robert here, because I think if there's a message around climate finance that I could offer you, it's that regulation is really important and that we need to no longer bypass the regulators in our NGO work, in our development work, and just pretend that they don't exist and only work with the ministries of water or with local governments. So Robert, over to you.
Do you want to talk about the tariff issue related to this? Yeah.
Now, I don't have to answer what Joel is telling me, but I really wanted to pick up that.
I told you he was very direct.
Yeah, I really want to pick up that thread. We are talking here about financing gap. We are also talking about private sector. We are also talking about water scarcity. In my country, water scarcity these days is always blamed on climate change. But what the regulator is asking, by the way, those three statements never miss, at least in my country when you are talking about high-level water challenges. The frustration of the regulator or regulation is, if that is the case, then how are we changing our behavior and management paradigms to reflect that we have these challenges, and even to reflect a commitment that you want to actually address those challenges? Because there is no way you are going to talk every day about private sector, forgetting that that money is not free. It has to be repaid. Now, private sector does not just bring in money. It does what is called, due diligence? It finds out about what is your policy and regulatory framework. Does it allow this kind of money to come in? And if it does, how are the other players in terms of their perspectives with regard to actually repayable finance? How is it? And I'm sure that I'll get my money. So this is why regulators are all about that. I like this rise of regulators.
I'm not surprised.
It is good. It is good. But as a regulator, I also know that there are people out there waiting in the wings to capture the regulator once he rises up, because they want to continue the status quo, because in any messy situation, there are people benefiting or whatever. There are pros and cons and all that. But I didn't wanted to add that in the previous conversation that regulation, because Jason talked about integrity, regulation is part of the integrity system within the water sector to actually assure that all the other pieces are working together, working coherently, and delivering the outcomes that the sector would like to see. If that is not happening, then there is something wrong. There is something you are actually either ignoring or sidelining. And this is really the work of the regulator to make sure that all these aspects work together. And for those who are interested, next week on 23rd, the regional regulatory body in the subcontinent, East and South Africa, will be talking about regulation with and for integrity. So if you are able to join, we can still delve into these matters.
That's the Water Integrity Network, which is an NGO working in these issues.
Yes. And the Eastern and Southern African Regulators Association.
Right.
They are coming together. Yeah.
I'm coming to you. Just the last question was around energy and the difference with water. Jason, can you?
What's the question?
It's around the relationship. Why has energy been so much more successful about transforming and actually raising private money as opposed to the water sector?
Well, that also needs another conversation on that. I mean, fundamentally, there's a lot of different, how do you call that? The simple reason we talk a lot is how the infrastructure are different in terms of the energy versus water, right? The investment in the water sectors, a lot of that in terms of the physical investment and the infrastructure is underground. From private sector investor perspective, if I compare to energy sectors, a power generation facilities, you have the turbine, typically comprise about more than 50 or 60% of the project value. So from a lender perspective, I can take that as collateral, right? From a lender perspective, there's two primary sources of payment. One is the collateral, the other one is the cash flow. So the primary payment is coming from the cash flow. The secondary is the collateral. So in the worst case scenario, how do I protect the lender's interest? So in the energy sector, you have the asset value there, it's tangible, you can take the collateral. For the water sectors, I mean, the underground assets values, from collateral perspective, it's very difficult from lender perspective, right? From collateral perspective. And then the cash flow itself, we talked a lot earlier about in terms of the tariff, the creditworthiness of the utility, all that, make that all very difficult. But that is almost the similar challenge that we have in the energy sector.
I want to supplement that by pointing back to you. Think about how much you pay in your energy bill every month versus what you pay in your water bill. And that's a good sign of what the difference is and why we are where we are globally in energy versus water financing. I've just been told that we have to wrap up. So I'm very sorry, but the cash will be in your accounts because we have all your information, and we'll be up here afterwards so we can take further questions. But I know there's a lot of things people still want to say, so I want to touch with each of you in the last 3 minutes and ask if there's any particular point you want to stress before we close. Jason?
Well, yeah, I mean, I just want to highlight that what I said at the beginning, the climate crisis to a large extent is about a water crisis. And to fix the issues, we really need to have a government at all levels to step up, to have the more commitment to invest more in the sectors, and to create an enabling environment, to create a more policy institutions and a regulatory framework to have cost-reflective tariff, to create a more credit-worthy utilities. That will help create the right environment to have a private sector come in to help scale up the private sector finance. On the private sector role, I mean, I think we didn't get a chance to talk about that. We look at the 2% or the small numbers, that's only from the financing perspective. But the other big part of that is the role of the private sector coming in to help bring the discipline, the accountability, and you talk about efficiency and gain early on. I mean, they have a lot of, they are the driver of the innovations, right? Bring new technologies, management expertise to help us to address some of the issues that we really needed in the water sectors. The non-revenue water, the performance-based contract working with the private sector can play a huge role, and we've been working on that quite a lot at the World Bank side as well. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Rachel, very quickly, sorry.
No, Nope, super quickly. Okay, so I'm going to do my closing thoughts just on like how would you access climate finance, right? So
Yes,
if you're interested.
please.
So number one thing is get your own house in order, right? So that means for nonprofits, be as amazing and as effective as you can be. Figure out who your customer is, right? Even if you're a nonprofit, you have a customer, and that customer shouldn't be just your funder. So really think about who your customer is, how can you efficiently deliver whatever value you are generating to that customer as effectively as possible. Likewise, if you're a service provider, we talked a lot about this, get your house in order, get to know your customers. Again, when I was talking about how information flows up, money goes down, it should be a little bit closer where you actually know your customers and you're actually delivering value to them so that they can trust you. And a few tangible things, I'm going to be super quick, is just get out there and get to know them, right? Do something that within the budget that you already have that gives you more exposure so that higher income customers suddenly are actually interested in paying their bills, right? Like do the small little baby steps instead of thinking about the $200 million big once in a lifetime PPI thing that will make it onto the PPI database. Baby steps, get more efficient at your operations. And then in terms of funders, it's just an ongoing plea. Please do more due diligence. Do due diligence. It's really important to ask questions and demand financial audits and statements and professionalize and I'm speaking mostly to philanthropy here, and I don't know, there's a lot of people in the chorus here, but there needs to be much better due diligence of the investments that are being made to make sure that it's not operating in parallel to the systems of local governance, local regulation, right, and services that need to be happening and need to be strengthened in order to be able to do better with the finance that you have and the funding you have so that down the road, when those climate financiers start waking up to water and really driving toward how do we channel our investments down to water, because now it's a really big issue, that we're ready.
Okay, thanks. Robert,
Sorry, Rachel, really quickly, is that climate money going to fill the gap that we have for WASH?
Is the climate money going to
Fill that gap for WASH?
That'll be a really nice problem to explore someday, but it's not an issue today, right?
Okay.
It will not, and part of it is because talk to me after about how much I really, really think the acronym WASH does a massive disservice when we're talking about funding.
Okay, we won't do that one, but I think the short answer is no, there's bigger things to study. Robert, we could also do a whole conference on water and regulation, but you want to give us a couple thoughts quickly?
Yes. For me, I think my main message is, especially to where I come from in terms of the global south. We can talk a lot about climate change and those big issues, but the fact and the reality is we have a real problem with basics. We have real problems with foundational issues. Even as much as we would want to appreciate as technocrats the effect or impact of climate change, can we address the basics? And the government has a very big role to play in this. And these basics are even spending the money you have and spending it better. Jason quoted 20% getting lost out of corruption and others. In my country, we had a quote some years back from a very senior finance official saying we are losing 30%. We cannot continue looking for more money if we are already losing what we already have and we are not spending it effectively. For the funders and financiers, yes, use your soft power, ask the right questions, and make sure that utilities especially are on the right path with everyone. Thank you very much.
And my final comment is picking up on Robert's point, going back to the title of this. This is not about the money. Do not be afraid of this. If you can't balance your checkbook, if you don't know if you have a pension, if you know nothing about your financial situation, don't be afraid of the financial issues around water, because the basics and fundamentals really have very little to do with financing. If our operations are technically and financially efficient, and our governance and regulatory arrangements are clear and transparent and being implemented with integrity, the money issue will start to get resolved. And until we start focusing on that, all the other things we want to work on, we're going to be frustrated on. So I want to thank you, everyone, for participating on this. I'm sorry to the people who got delayed, and thank you to the panel. I really appreciate it, and thank you for your great questions.
No, thank you, Joel, Jason, Robert, and Rachel. We could do this all day, trust us. And so